As Machiavelli mentions earlier in The Prince, it can be extremely difficult to hold on to new territories, particularly when peopled by an alien folk with divergent customs, language, and religion. However, despite the odds, at times these challenges can be overcome. Alexander the Great conquered vast swaths of Asia in just a few years and died shortly thereafter. One would expect that the whole region would rise up in rebellion and eject his successors from power. Yet the only serious trouble his successors had was contending with their own interpersonal ambitions and infighting. Why is this? A monarch may either rule directly with servants appointed to administer his kingdom and carry out his orders, or else a monarch may rule with the aid of any number of barons and aristocrats who are not appointed by the king, but hold their titles thanks to hereditary privilege. These aristocrats hold their own lands and have their own subjects who recognize these aristocratic elite as their masters and are more naturally loyal to them. The king is more powerful when he rules with ministers, since he's the only person within the state who the people recognize as superior, and they have no special loyalty to his ministers. No one is going to fight and die for a bureaucrat. The Turkish sultans ruled in this manner, while the French king was surrounded by barons whose rights and privileges stretched back to ancient times, and the king could only deprive them of these privileges at his own peril. Machiavelli argues that of these two systems, it is harder to conquer a state or empire such as Turkey, but easier to hold it, while it is inversely somewhat easier to conquer a kingdom like France, but much harder to hold it. Under the Sultan, there's a more coordinated and singular interest of the state, wielded by one ruler who can bring the force of his realm to bear directly. There are no competing barons with ties to the royal bloodline who can make competing claims or invite a foreign army in to help them wrest control of the government themselves. There's also no nobility who will change their colors and aid in the invasion once the foreign conqueror approaches. However, should the ruler be removed from power, there aren't competing centers of legitimacy and sovereignty apart from his throne, and thus, such a people are more easily put under the yoke once conquered. To maintain his new lands in such a place, all that really need concern the conqueror is the elimination of the former monarch and his family, in addition to maintaining order and trying not to make his subjects' lives worse. What Machiavelli calls the Kingdom of Darius, or the Achaemenid Persian Empire, was of this more centralized Turkish model. Once Alexander the Great had conquered the Persians' lands, defeated their armies, and the emperor was dead, Alexander was securely in command for the aforementioned reasons, and had his successors been more united, they could have commanded the region without worry. However, fractious states with an established aristocracy or feudal lords can never be held so easily, due to their structure and the incentives within the territory. Likewise, governing cities and states as an outsider accustomed to a tradition of republican government brings similar difficulties of retaining ground once conquered. On ruling conquered, self-governing republics, Machiavelli states the following, quote, "When the states you invade have been accustomed to governing themselves without a monarch and living in freedom under their own laws, then there are three ways of holding on to them. The first is to reduce them to rubble. The second is to go and live there yourself. The third is to let them go on living under their own laws, make them pay you a tax, and install a government of just a few local people who will keep the state as a whole friendly. Since this government has been set up by the invading ruler, its members know they can't survive without his support and will do everything they can to defend his authority. Once you've decided not to destroy it, the best way to hold a self-governing city is with the help of its own citizens." End quote. For examples of this, Machiavelli gives Sparta and Rome. The Spartans had gained control of both Athens and Thebes and governed them with a few local people. In the end, however, they lost both cities. The Romans, in their turn, razed Capua, Carthage, and Numantia to the ground, a much simpler, though violent and perhaps not as profitable solution. The Romans tried to hold on to Greece in a similar manner as the Spartans tried with Athens and Thebes, granting them self-government and leaving them to their own laws. This proved fruitless, however, and in the end they had to destroy and raze a number of cities across Greece in order to hold firm control over the region. Machiavelli finishes his chapter admitting that the only way to hold on to republican territories as an outsider is to destroy them, saying, quote, "If you conquer a city accustomed to self-government and opt not to destroy it, you can expect it to destroy you." End quote. The difficulty with ruling foreign republics is that the existence of their government isn't contingent on the existence of a hereditary ruling elite whose monarch's line stretches back into the foggy past. People within monarchies are accustomed to being ruled by a singular, explicit hierarch, which is understood by all to be above them. In the absence of a monarch, they are typically willing to accept someone taking a place of governorship over them. This is why Middle Eastern regimes default to strongmen unless compelled to be democratic by outside forces. Republics, for all their problems, have the virtue of being able to generate their own internal order from the elite members of their society, and will routinely end and reestablish their own governments. For these reasons, they are notoriously difficult to conquer and hold on to as an outsider unless the ruler is willing to be ruthless with those who would not bend the knee. All this talk of how to govern various kinds of conquered states is purely academic, though, unless the sovereign is first able to conquer a land in the first place. Chapters 6, 7, and 8 of The Prince all look at the various ways a ruler may gain control over territory. Chapter 6 is concerned with states won by the new ruler's own forces and abilities. Machiavelli begins this chapter with the disclaimer that he'll be highlighting particularly exceptional examples in history, and that although these rulers can serve as a model to imitate if conquest is the goal, one cannot too closely walk in their footsteps. Reason being is there are too many variables for any two scenarios to be the same. Thus, variation and improvisation will be required. What worked for one ruler in a particular place and time might not work for another. Ultimately, though, staying in power in a new land and establishing a new government is contingent on both the abilities and failings of the new ruler. According to Machiavelli, some of the most impressive rulers in history who gained power through their own qualities rather than luck are Moses, Cyrus, Romulus, and Theseus. Regarding Moses, he does have not much to say since he was working as the Lord's instrument on earth. However, Machiavelli argues that he should be admired nonetheless for his doubtless great qualities and the favor that the Lord bestowed upon him. For Cyrus and the others, though, we have less supernatural reasons to suppose their success. Hand of God aside, each of these men attained prominence in a way not wholly different from Moses, in that they were possessed of an ability superior to most men in ruling, and luck had given them the initial opportunity to build something great. Without the opportunity, their talents would have gone unused, and without their talents, the opportunity would have gone begging. If Moses hadn't found the children of Israel in bondage in Egypt and crying out to the Lord for deliverance, they'd have been unwilling to follow him. Had Romulus not been abandoned at birth and chosen to leave the Alba Longa, he never would have founded Rome and become its king. Cyrus couldn't have become emperor had he not found the Persians chafing and ready to rebel against their overlords, the Medes, who'd become, quote, undisciplined and effeminate after a long period of peace, end quote. Establishing a new state or nation requires not only tremendous ability and opportunity, but the organization and establishment of a stable ruling structure. This is perhaps the greatest challenge. No one really believes in changes until they've been sold the experience of it. Thus, the support of an incoming would-be lord by dissatisfied factions of the status quo is only partial until they see results and get a taste of winning. Victory begets victory, yet it takes a lot to overcome the entrenched interests of the old regime, which often remains even after the old masters have been overthrown. For a lesser man compared to the aforementioned lords, Machiavelli cites Hero of Syracuse. Originally an ordinary citizen, Hero rose to become king of Syracuse. The only luck he had lay in threat of invasion from the Carthaginians. He was elected as military commander of the Syracusans, and was so successful they made him their king. He was so capable in his citizen life prior to rule that one writer stated, quote, he had all it takes to be a king except a kingdom, end quote. Hero then disbanded the army and mustered a new one, broke old alliances, made new ones, and with his own men as a firm foundation, he was able to rule and build as he would. Thus, it cost him a great deal to gain power, but very little to hold onto it once gained. The inverse is true of people who are propelled into their positions by luck. From The Prince, Chapter 8, quote, a private citizen who becomes a ruler out of sheer good luck needn't take much effort to take his state, but will have to sweat if he is to hold on to it. He has no trouble climbing to his pedestal since he was lifted there, but as soon as he is up on top, there will be any number of problems. I'm talking about situations where someone buys a territory with money or is simply granted it as a favor. This was the case with quite a few rulers of the cities in Ionia and the Hellespont. Darius gave them their thrones so that they would govern with his security and prestige in mind. Another example is those emperors who started out as private citizens and rose to power by bribing the army. These men rely entirely on the support and continuing success of the people who gave them power, which is to say, on two extremely unreliable and unstable quantities. They didn't know how to hang on to power. Even if they did, they wouldn't be able to. They didn't know how because unless they were remarkably gifted and competent, we can hardly suppose that their lives as private citizens have equipped them for command. They won't be able to in any event because they don't possess an army that can be relied upon to stay friendly and loyal. Like anything that appears suddenly and too fast, regimes that come out of nothing inevitably have shallow roots and will tend to crash in the first storm. Unless, of course, the man who is made ruler turns out to be so talented that he immediately sets to work to defend what luck has brought his way, and to build the foundations that another leader would have established before coming to power. End quote. Machiavelli mentions two Italian men who rose to lordship from nothing in two different manners, the latter through luck. Francesco Sforza and Cesare Borgia. Sforza rose from being a commoner to the Duke of Milan and won his station in power with enormous effort, but held on to it easily enough once in power. The combination of competence and heroic will predominantly led to Sforza becoming lord. In contrast, Cesare Borgia was also doubtless a man of talent, but his rise would have been impossible without luck. Cesare Borgia was the illegitimate son of Pope Alexander VI and received his territories thanks to his father's position. When his father died, he lost them, despite the fact that, according to Machiavelli, he used all means available and did everything a sensible, capable man would do to lay the foundations for his own rule in the lands another man's armies and position had won him. To grant his son lands that weren't controlled by the church, Pope Alexander VI had to undermine the status quo and authority of his rivals so as to seize part of their lands with impunity. To do this, he aided the Venetians, who had their own purposes, in bringing in King Louis XII of France to Italy. For his part, the Pope granted the King of France a papal bull of divorce from his then-wife Joan of France, so he could marry Anne of Brittany, and made his chief advisor, Georges d'Amboise, Cardinal of Rouen. In exchange for this, his illegitimate son, Cesare Borgia, was given the Duchy of Valentinois, military assistance to help subjugate the feudal lords of Papal Romagna, and a prince's bride, Charlotte of Albret, from the Kingdom of Navarre. All this Cesare owed to his dad being pope. Using trickery and deceit, he lured his primary rivals, the Orsines and Senegalia, into a trap and had them killed. He held the Duchy of Urbino and Romagna and felt he had gained local support, for the people were beginning to enjoy some prosperity. To hear Machiavelli tell it, who was Florence's ambassador at the time, the previous rulers of Borgia's new territory were much more interested in pillaging the people rather than providing good governance, and thus theft, feuds, and injustices of all sorts were rampant. To deal with this, Borgia hired the cruel Ramiro de Orco and gave him complete control over restoring order. Swiftly, de Orco pacified and united the area, but in the process gained a brutal reputation. To benefit from the gains de Orco had made, but to deflect blame from himself and the resentment of his new subjects, Cesare Borgia had de Orco tried and killed on pretext. He left his beheaded corpse in the piazza of Cesena with a wooden block and a knife besides, as a bloody spectacle, leaving the people both gratified and shocked. He also established a local civil court and built his own army, staffed with his own men to solidify power. At this point, the only obstacle to further expansion was King Louis XII of France himself. The main goal at this juncture for Cesare Borgia was to be free from the influence of the King of France, which he may well have done had his father, Pope Alexander VI, not died. What concerned Borgia most was that the successor pope would be unfriendly to him and his ambitions. To guard against this, he devised 4 schemes. First, eliminate the families of those whose land he'd taken so it could not be restored to them through the new pope. Second, gain the support of the noble families in Rome, who could frustrate papal initiatives. Third, gain as much control as possible of the college who'd elect the Pope. And lastly, gain as much territory as possible so he could withstand a direct assault from the Papal States should that event arise. At the time of Pope Alexander's death, he'd achieved 3 of these aims. Also, he was gaining more territory, capturing Perugia, Piombino, and had taken Pisa under his protection. Despite all his gains, though, only Romagna was firmly under his control. He wouldn't get the final say, and the Pope was menaced by 2 armies and soon found himself mortally ill and died shortly after his father. Cesare Borgia lived to see himself raised from the bastard son of a pope to a lord in his own right, and he was able to maintain his powers with talent and ruthlessness. And as a stroke of perhaps divine justice or irony, he would see it all taken away from him at the apex of his power. Had he lived longer, he may have been able to hold on to, or at least maintain, some of his gains and beget a lordly line. The story of Cesare Borgia is illustrative in that not only is it difficult to hold on to states won by luck and the forces of another's arms, but even if you play all the right moves to hold on to power, as Machiavelli claims Borgia did, the luck that gave you power may just as easily take it away. The final category of victory to gain sovereignty over a state given in The Prince are those won through crime. On this, Machiavelli has comparatively less to say. The 2 primary ways one can become a ruler through crime is either by enacting some atrocity or slaughter of the existing elite and then stepping into the power vacuum. The other is by gaining authority, wealth, and influence and seizing control of the throne with the backing of vested interests internally. For the first of these cases, Machiavelli gives the Sicilian Agathocles, who would raise himself from the lowest status to king of Syracuse. From The Prince, page 43, quote, "Born a potter's son, he lived a life of depravity from start to finish. All the same, mixed with that depravity were such excellent mental and physical qualities that, having joined the Syracusan army, he rose through the ranks and eventually became commander-in-chief. Once he'd taken charge, Agathocles decided to make himself king, using whatever violence was necessary to keep the power conferred on him as commander without being obliged to anyone. He discussed his intentions with Hamilcar, a Carthaginian whose army was then fighting in Sicily, and reached an agreement with him. Then one morning he called an assembly of the people and the Senate, as if he had important state business to discuss. At a pre-arranged signal, his soldiers moved in and killed all the senators and richest men in town. After this massacre, Agathocles became king of Syracuse and held his throne without any resistance from the people. Twice defeated by the Carthaginians and then actually besieged, not only did he manage to defend his own town, but, leaving some men behind to resist the siege, he led the rest out of Syracuse to attack Africa. The siege was lifted and the Carthaginians pushed to the brink of collapse, at which point they accepted an agreement which allowed them to keep Africa and left Sicily to Agathocles." End quote. Machiavelli continues on page 44, quote, "As I said, he had no backers or benefactors when he took power, but rose through the ranks, surviving all kinds of hardships and dangers. And when he'd got power, he knew how to take tough, dangerous decisions to hold on to it. On the other hand, we can hardly describe killing fellow citizens, betraying friends, and living without loyalty, mercy, or creed as signs of talent. Methods like that may bring you power, but not glory." End quote. This sort of analysis and tone is typical of Machiavelli. I believe it's inaccurate to characterize him as a completely amoral man. This passage clearly shows some contempt for the deeds of Agathocles, yet he is unflinching in his honest appraisal of the matter and illustrating the practical methods of seizing and holding power, morally legitimate or no. The other example Machiavelli gives of a man who won his power through crime is Olivero, a man from Fermo who lived at the time of Pope Alexander VI and was a contemporary of Machiavelli. Orphaned while young, Olivero was brought up by his uncle, Giovanni Fogliani. He would go on to join the army and eventually design to no longer be servant but master. Unlike Agathocles, Olivero would make contacts in the city and form an agreement with these conspirators for him to take power. One notable co-conspirator of Olivero was Vitellozzo Vitelli. After a time of service to Cesare Borgia, the same mentioned earlier, Olivero called a banquet, inviting his uncle Fogliani, along with the great and good of Fermo, to attend. Then, in a manner reminiscent of Game of Thrones, he had them butchered by his soldiers and besieged the palace of the governing council. Those inside soon bent the knee and acquiesced to Oliveroto's rule as absolute dictator of Fermo. The treacherous servant of a treacherous master, Oliveroto, along with his accomplice Vitelli, would soon find themselves both strangled at Cesare Borgia's command. Closing Chapter 8, Machiavelli ruminates as to why certain cruel and criminal men, like Oliverotto, can seize power and then lose it, while others, like Agathocles, can hold on to their throne for years and years without ever a serious revolt from the people. Machiavelli chalks it up to prudent, selective cruelty and criminality. In the game of power acquisition, it's better to be utterly ruthless in the beginning than taper off as time goes on, rather than be not cruel enough or decisive enough, and then becoming more cruel and more intolerable with time in order to hold on to power. Machiavelli's lesson is to get the violence over as soon as possible and as merciless as need be, and then slowly hand out favors. After the rival elite have been liquidated, even cruelly so, the people are more likely to tolerate the new monarch, especially if they see their general conditions and security improved with the new administration. To put it flippantly, the new king may be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. This has been Mr. Patriarch. If you've enjoyed this video, the best thing you can do to help me out is subscribe if you haven't already. Like, comment, and share with somebody who you think will benefit from this material. I look forward to seeing you again soon when we'll continue our analysis of the Prince. Patriarch out.